I'm Michael Krasny, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly podcast where we do deep dive interviews each week with national and international authors, journalists, tech and business experts, artists, scientists, entertainers, and opinion shapers, and we include your questions and comments. We cover a wide range of intellectually engaging and timely topics and issues distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence, and we invite you to become a member of the podcast simply by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E, and membership, among other advantages, entitles you to be with us and stream us live every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, simply, again, by going to graymatter.show. Today's episode, I want to welcome journalist, author, editor, and columnist Bret Stephens, who joined the New York Times in 2017 and had a career before that with both the Wall Street Journal and the Jerusalem Post, where he served as editor-in-chief. He won a Pulitzer Prize for commentary back in 2013, and he's the author of American Retreat. Born in Mexico City, he was educated at the London School of Economics and the University of Chicago. And I welcome Bret Stephens to Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. Delighted to have you.
Thank you, Michael. And just a brief correction. Although I was raised in Mexico City, I was born in New York. I don't want to foreclose my presidential aspirations.
Well, it's too bad that if you're 50, so you're able to run past 35. And there are a lot of people who would probably like to see you as a candidate. Including maybe yourself, since you're not exactly tickled with either of these two candidates that are on the slate. You call them Genghis on the one hand, you could imagine or guess who that is, and Grandpa.
Yeah, I think in another column, I described them as a competition between the morally unfit and the mentally unfit, which maybe is a little too harsh to the president, but it was a turn of phrase that came out during the course of one of my weekly conversations with Gail Collins.
Which are delightful to read, and they appear every Tuesday in my edition of the paper of record, the New York Times. Let's start off by talking about domestic politics, which you are very involved in, and as we mentioned, the presidential race. I just wonder, as someone who laments what's happened to your party, having become, I think I can paraphrase it as, become a Trump cult. What you felt yesterday when Trump was up on Capitol Hill and he was bumping fists with Mitch McConnell, who had criticized him pretty harshly about January 6th. And you had all these figures who had once, at one time, been pretty strident in their criticism of Trump. They're showing unity. I mean, just name them one after another. Rubio, J.D. Vance, Lindsey Graham. Every one of them had said critical things at one point about Donald Trump, but they were all there cheering him, unified.
You know, it's not surprising to have politicians in a party rally behind leaders about whom they have privately or even publicly expressed grave reservations or strong objections. To me, that's just politics. The real source of distress for me is, to quote Julian Benda, it's the treason of the intellectuals, the betrayal of the clerks, the intellectual class of the conservative movement that had stood in opposition to so much of what Trump says, believes, and does, and that has nonetheless fallen, generally speaking, into line behind him. That's the part of it that I sort of find unforgivable, because these guys, their careers don't hinge on at least pretending to like the party leader. There's presumably some opportunity for independence of mind, and that has not been greatly evident in the last 8 or 9 years in which Trump has been a figure on the scene.
Do you ever speculate, Bret, about what I imagine some of your idols when you think about intellectuals in the Republican and conservative vein? Think about, William F. Buckley, obviously, Leo Strauss, Milton Friedman, Irving Kristol, maybe particularly Charles Krauthammer, what they would have thought about this Trump phenomenon?
Well, Krauthammer, who passed away, I think in 2017, 2018, to his great credit, and not at all surprising, was always a harsh critic of Trump. I don't know what Bill Buckley would have said, but I know that his son, Chris, has been foursquare against everything that Trump stands for. I feel that someone like Irving Kristol, who I had a chance to meet when he was very old and I was very young, would have felt the same way. But there's a kind of a Manichaeanism which has taken over, I think, much of the conservative world, which is to say, the other side is evil. So if it's on my side, they'll accept much and forgive much. My fear, which I think has been more or less borne out, is that the constellation of ideas that formed modern conservatism, and which I think are essential to the well-functioning of an effective democracy, those ideas have more or less collapsed. I mean, just to give you one example, the conservative case for immigration, we are overwhelmingly beneficiaries of a relatively liberal immigration regime, if you will. I understand that doesn't need to mean massive illegal immigration, but we are well served when people with energy and ambition and dreams come to our shores. You can look at George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan and that conservative consensus that lasted all the way up until, 10 or 15 years ago. That's gone, and it's been replaced by a kind of blood and soil national conservatism, which I just think is bad for the country. The elaboration of ideas around the benefits of free trade and actually the free market, which were also a piece of the conservatism that I knew and grew up in, that is essentially collapsed in the face of Trump's protectionism and big spending and embrace of every element of the welfare state. So, and the isolationism, I should say, or the quasi-isolationism, maybe you want to call it truculent nationalism, not quite isolationism, the eagerness with which so many of Trump's acolytes seem to have for turning our backs on the plight of the Ukrainians and that country's struggle for freedom. All of this leaves us without a morally sound conservative movement. What we have instead of a conservative movement is an illiberal movement, and illiberalism almost definitionally is bad for democracy.
When you hear conservatives now talking about too many migrants coming into this country and the danger in that, and we can have another 9/11, almost feeling as if that's preconceived, likely and more than likely destined to happen, what's your response?
Well, look, I think that some of the complaints are legitimate. I mean, the Biden administration essentially created the very crisis that's now doing so much damage to the presidency by kind of announcing that all of the Trump orders, the Remain in Mexico orders, and so on, would be reversed under his administration. And I think it's foolish to deny that there are adverse consequences to massive, unrestricted regulation where we don't know who's coming across our borders. And some of those people, some percentage, it's small, but when the numbers are this big, it means a lot of people aren't people we want here in the United States. That's a problem. It's a problem that so many cities from El Paso all the way up to Boston have major challenges in accommodating, particularly the children of these immigrants who are arriving in desperate straits. And it's a problem because it creates a climate, political climate, which wants to shut down the borders to everyone. So all of that is I think, absolutely fair and legitimate as a criticism of the Biden administration's version of an immigration policy. But what bothers me is that the crisis that we have now is becoming a blanket excuse for thinking of all forms of immigration, except, I don't know, the odd Scandinavian PhD or whoever, as undesirable. I look at my own family history, and I am one or two generations removed from immigrants whom the Henry Adamses of the world in the late 19th century or early 20th century viewed as undesirable. My paternal great-grandfather was a carpenter who came to this country with his family very poor after the Kishinev pogrom of 1903, worked in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. He didn't have a PhD. My mother's mother sewed dresses at Bergdorf Goodman. She arrived as a penniless refugee, not a great economic contributor. But nonetheless, within a generation or two, they were able to realize quite fully the American dream. And that's been the story for most of us who are here. And so to have a movement that turns its back on the story of their own grandparents seems depressing and shameful.
Here's a question from Seth in Fort Myers, Florida, who wants to know, if we're overprotective regarding immigration, how would you suggest fixing it?
Well, there's no question we have to gain some control over our borders, which we don't have. And because the crisis has reached the point that it has, I think Biden's executive order on asylum seeking, which is now being abused by many migrants because they know that the system is effectively porous and is probably never going to put them in front of an immigration court. I think that those measures are in fact necessary, as are measures to cajole our Mexican partners to better police their southern border. I am not against a border wall. In fact, let me rephrase that. I am for a border wall because the absence of a border wall, among other things, invites incredibly dangerous border crossings in remote areas of the border, which frequently lead to tragedy. And I think a border wall ultimately is both symbolically important and also will have a deterrent effect against some of the most dangerous kinds of migration. But beyond that, my colleague Tom Friedman expressed it well. Yes, a wall, but big gates. We need big gates. We need to be able to bring in people in a regularized way so that it makes sense for them to apply for visas at U.S. consulates, whether it's in Quito, Ecuador, Guatemala City or Mexico City or wherever, and then come through those gates so that we know who's arriving, and so that we know that they can come into the United States in a way that isn't going to massively strain our overburdened public services. That's essentially immigration as most of us knew it in the last many decades. It's the immigration system that allowed my mother to arrive, papers in hand, and to come here. And what we have now, instead of a lawful system, is a lawless system that in fact winds up penalizing the rules followers, and that itself is problematic. So, I mean, that's the way I've expressed this is a little cliched, but it gets at the idea of what my sense of a good policy might be. And it should bring in lots of migrants because we have a demographic problem in this country. We are getting older. We are not meeting the replacement rate in terms of the fertility of U.S. citizens. We benefit from the energy and youth of many of those migrants, but we have to do it in a kind of a lawful, sensible way that also doesn't offend or provoke a backlash among American citizens who fear that in a fixed pot economy, some of their share is being taken from them.
Do you think migration will be the telling factor in this presidential election? I mean, you've gone on record as saying you think Trump will probably, all things being equal now, be elected at this point. I mean, you were being a little bit of a soothsayer, and maybe things can change between now and then. But
yeah, I mean, I offer my predictions with a large grain of salt. I've been wrong many times before. But you look at any of the polling, and immigration is an issue that rises straight to the top, not only because of its effects on, or its neuralgic effect on, conservative, right-wing, Sean Hannity-loving conservatives, but also on working class Americans who, with justice, feel that their jobs are being undercut, their wages are being undercut, because you have a large pool of desperate migrants who are willing to work longer for less. That's a working class issue. That should be an issue for Bernie Sanders. In fact, it used to be an issue for Bernie Sanders for many years until he sort of changed his tune on this subject. And it's what I think is going to propel Trump into, or one of the major factors that will propel him into a second term. I hope I'm wrong, but that's where my bet is placed.
More important than reproductive rights, for example, which will turn a lot of women out to the polls?
I think the question of reproductive rights moved a lot of votes in 2022. I'm not sure it's going to be as salient now as it was then. The effects of the ruling have had 3 years to make themselves felt. More and more women who a generation or two ago would have needed abortions now can achieve, terminate their pregnancies in the very early stages with pill, with an abortifacient. So the politics of it, I think, plays a little differently. I'm not sure it's quite the winning ticket that Democrats thought it would have been, although I'd be happy to be proved wrong that the ultimate effect of Dobbs is to prevent a second Trump term.
You mentioned Tom Friedman and you mentioned your mother. I want to make a segue here because your mother, whose name is Xenia, lovely name, you said went into hiding because of her Jewishness and does not want to go into hiding again, understandably. And you thought we were at a precipice now. You said, like we were maybe with Theodore Herzl and a time when it was very dangerous to be a Jew. I mean, being a Zionist
it's
now,
becoming dangerous to be a Jew again, and
that's exactly what I'm getting at here. I mean, you've written almost as many articles about Israel and the Middle East as Tom Friedman has. I think 30 to 40. I don't know if there's a race here or competition, but you both have taken it very seriously. And what I'm interested in finding out from you at this point is, it used to be that people separated Zionism and Judaism, or Jewishness and Zionism. Is that separation becoming simply less of a factor now, to the degree that it's coupled together, soldered together?
I'm not sure the premise of your question is right. People used to understand that nearly every Jew in America was, in some sense, a Zionist. I say in some sense because some of them were right-wing Zionists, some centrists, some left-wing Zionists, but all of them, almost all Jews in America, up until quite recently, felt strongly that Israel had a moral right to exist as a sovereign, democratic Jewish state. I'm not sure the Jewish community is quite as united on that subject anymore, and there's been a powerful effort, and I don't use the word powerful in a positive way, a powerful effort to make what I think is a specious distinction between Judaism and Zionism, because ultimately the two seem to me deeply linked, and I think anti-Zionism, and I can talk about this at length, I think anti-Zionism is the anti-Semitism of our day. You can point to an exception here and there, but by and large, I think that's true.
Excuse me, Jonathan Sacks, Chief Rabbi of the UK, said exactly that this is the new anti-Semitism.
Well, he was just quoting me. No, I'm kidding. Jonathan Sacks was an extraordinary and wonderful figure. But yeah, I'm of the same view. And
but excuse me, some of the groups like Jewish Group for Peace and so forth.
Jewish Voice for Peace. I'm not sure how many Jews and Jewish Voices for Peace are actually Jews, or could recite the Shema, or do any of the kind of most basic, perform any of the most basic rituals of Jewish life.
Aren't there Jews on the left now who are out there protesting what's going on in Gaza and joining many students and feeling solidarity?
Well, so I mean, I think distinctions have to be made. it's perfectly legitimate to be a left-wing Jew who thinks that Israel's policies in Gaza are wrong-headed, both destructive and self-destructive. I'm not speaking, this is not my view, but I think I want to make it clear, like, if you're a left-wing Jew who thinks that the war in Gaza is completely misjudged, and disproportionate, and that it's not achieving its aims, and it is inflicting too much suffering on innocent Palestinian civilians, and that it will do more to bring new recruits to Hamas or some version of Hamas than it will to destroy Hamas as a political force. One may absolutely legitimately take that position as a Jew. I would argue against it, but that's an honorable argument to have. What's not honorable is essentially for Jews to take the side of Hamas, for Jews to call for the destruction of the national home of a majority of Jewish people in this world, to chant slogans that call for wiping out a member state of the United Nations, knowing full well that the consequences in real life of, God forbid, that result would be mass murder and killing on a scale that we haven't seen since the 1940s, since the Shoah. That is not legitimate. That is absolutely not a legitimate point of view. And I don't know whether this is a view that's taken by people who claim to be Jewish or perhaps sincerely are, but I know of, I can think of no plausible excuse for any human being, much less any Jew, to advocate a policy which is genocidal in effect, whether it's genocidal in intent or not.
Well, when you think about Messianic Jews for Jesus and so forth, there's every kind of variety among this ethnic people.
Jews for Jesus is not Judaism. I mean,
it can't be. I mean, it's
lots of people.
It's self-canceling.
I mean, I can call myself this or that, right? But I'm not that. To be a Jew for Jesus is a contradiction in terms. It means you're a Christian. By all means, you're a Jewish convert to Christianity. God bless you. It's a free country, but it's not Judaism.
I told that to a young, pretty vocal Jew for Jesus, and his response was, "Praise the Lord." I mean, I said almost what you just said in paraphrase form. But now we've got things going on the other border with Hezbollah firing missiles and so forth. I think you've gone on record, haven't you, as saying we could really be headed to another Third World War?
Well, look, what I mean is this. If you think of how the Second World War began, it's wrong to think that, say, World War II began on December 7th, 1941, or if you prefer, September 1st, 1939. World War II was a collection of regional conflicts which ultimately overspilled their edges and became one global conflict. I mean, Japan's invasion of China and its ambitions in the Far East was one regional conflict. Germany's ambitions vis-a-vis Poland, or Russia's ambitions vis-a-vis Poland, was another one. There were smaller conflicts in Spain or Abyssinia that all were precursors to this, and they eventually became worse and worse and worse. And each side discovered that their fundamental values and interests corresponded with like-minded nations. So Germany, Japan, Italy, and for a couple of years, the Soviet Union were on a single side, and Britain, the United States, and their allies on the other. And I look at the world and I see one regional conflict in the Middle East, which keeps growing wider. And I look at I look at Ukraine, and a conflict that also is not only titanic in scale, but could also expand beyond that, its theater, and the possibility for conflict in Taiwan or elsewhere in Southeast Asia, somewhere in the South China Sea. And I notice the declaration of unlimited friendship between Russia and China, the strategic alliance between Russia and Iran, the economic ties between Iran and China, North Korea providing artillery and other munitions for the Russian effort in Ukraine.
And forgive me, Putin now saying that he's going to be providing nuclear weaponry as well to other countries. He's on record.
Right. And so all of this, history doesn't repeat itself, as Twain said, but it sure does rhyme. And a lot of what's happening today rhymes with the middle of the 1930s, when suddenly there was a kind of an axis of fascistic states or totalitarian states squaring off against democratic countries in various corners of the world. And that's why I think that I look at Gaza or Lebanon as discrete theaters in a much wider conflict.
A question apropos from Harry in Denver, Colorado. He says the Ukraine war is one of the first wars where a disadvantaged country was highly technical. As the West drags its feet in support, Ukraine engineers have figured out how to deliver a few pounds of explosives 10 miles away for $1,000. This tech will certainly not stay in Ukraine in the long term. Does this pose an asymmetrical threat to the United States? Thank you for the question.
It's an excellent question, and I just want to stop and say, just judging by the last couple questions, you've got a terrific audience. These are smart questions. I think Ukraine is going to change the face of warfare forever. And we will find that many of the multi-billion-dollar investments we've made in various kinds of weapon systems will not make sense, not be effective, and may in fact be more liability than asset in future battlefields. I mean, just take something like a nuclear-powered modern-day Ford-class aircraft carrier, about $15 billion, not including the carrier strike group. And all of those increasingly vulnerable to hypersonic weapons that can be produced much more cheaply and can be fired in very large numbers, so that these assets that the United States had, which used to give us clear battlefield advantages, may have all the value of the battleships that were sunk Pearl Harbor on December 7th. And we're looking at a future in warfare where where the cost question is really important. How much does it cost to build an asset? And what price do you pay for losing that asset? And can you achieve greater effects by producing large quantities of small, cheap, but effective munitions or munitions delivery systems, as opposed to very large and exquisite weapon systems, which is what the Pentagon has favored for the past many decades, and which in fact for many years gave us a great advantage over our adversaries. So there are companies now in the United States that are taking close note of what's happening in Ukraine and observing how you can merge off-the-shelf systems like drones with AI-powered or algorithms based on a tremendous amount of computing power to very precisely deliver kinetic force in the spot where your adversary is most vulnerable. And I think military historians in 50, 60 years will be talking about the Ukraine war, maybe as we now talk about the Boer War or other wars where you had the intervention of a game-changing technology like the Gatling gun, for instance, or the tank, or the aircraft carrier, and notice that this is going to be one of those revolutions in military affairs that we've been speaking about for a long time, and now it's come about, but in a way that we didn't quite expect.
The other thing that worries me about the question that you've just addressed is how easy it's going to be for terrorists. Inexpensive and easier.
Well, I mean, and that, of course, was what was vividly proved on 9/11 when, terrorists demonstrated that, box cutters and a willingness to sacrifice 19 men could achieve strategic effects. And I think it will be true also in ways that are very, very difficult to imagine, because if we could imagine them, we would be probably doing more to stop them. But the proliferation of extraordinary computing power and very inexpensive delivery systems that can be produced not only by highly developed economies, but by third-rate economies like the Iranian economy, it just changes the game.
You've been advocating supplying cruise missiles for F-16s?
They're called JASMs, which are it's an acronym, Joint Attack Strike something or other. It escapes me at the moment. But I think that if we're one way in which we can help the Ukrainians reverse their battlefield reversals is by giving them munitions that can achieve what they were able to achieve in the first 12 months of the war, which is to destroy the depots, the arms depots, the fuel supplies, other kind of nodes in the Russian war machine that crippled the Russian war effort. And foolishly, the Biden administration had effectively vetoed that option for the Ukrainians. Now they seem to have changed their mind, at least in the Kharkiv area of battle. But if Russia is able to supply itself, because by using its great strategic depth, to supply itself and put its assets off limits to Ukrainian attack, they're going to win the war. It's that simple. And the Biden administration needs to ask itself if that's an outcome they're prepared to accept. I hope not.
Aren't they going to win the war if Trump is elected president? Isn't it a lost cause if Trump becomes president for Ukraine?
Well, this is one of my great fears about a Trump presidency. Now, there are people who are sort of in his orbit who have whispered to me that it's not necessarily the case. Trump's what Trump says rhetorically is different from the way his administration performed in practice. I mean, just to give you one example, for all of his fulminating against Ukraine during his presidency, the Trump administration did more to help Ukrainians prepare for the eventual invasion and to arm them than certainly the Obama administration had, despite Obama's pledges of support. So with Trump, the policy is sometimes not just different from the rhetoric, it's 180 degrees from it. You saw something like this with Trump's Syria policy. He said we were going to pull all American troops out of Syria, and quietly that never happened, right? But that's a real fingers crossed kind of approach to Ukraine, to hope that for all that he's saying, he doesn't mean it. And it may be the case that the first time around, he surrounded himself with foreign policy advisors who were essentially kind of very classic conservatives, or neoconservatives, whether it was General McMaster's or John Bolton. And that this time he's going to bring in a troop of kind of dedicated Trumpies who have drunk the Kool-Aid and really believe that his brand of nationalism makes sense for the United States.
Europe itself, though, is turning more to the right. Can Ukraine continue to have the kind of support it's had from the European continent?
Well, it's a real worry because many of the parties of the extreme in Europe, and by the way, this is also true of the extreme left, have ties, sometimes hidden, sometimes not so well hidden, with the Russian government, and have expressed views that are sympathetic to Putin. And I think he sees this as an avenue of opportunity for him, and not just Viktor Orban, but Marine Le Pen, who could yet become the president of France or one of her successors in her party, the AfD, the far-right German party that continues to grow stronger. And there's always been a kind of anti-Americanism on the hard right of Europe. as again on the hard left, that goes without saying, but also on the hard right, a belief that Europe's real enemy is not Russia, it's Islam, it's Muslim migrants, it's the South, and that Putin actually is or could be both an ally in that struggle against, Islamism, and as well as a natural economic partner in terms of the supply of cheap energy. That's where they're coming from. And the failure of mainstream parties in Europe to provide for growth, to have a better immigration system, to break the kind of long-term stagnation that Europe finds itself in has just provided an opening for them. Unfortunately, it's an opening in the wrong direction.
Another good, thoughtful question for you, Bret, from Susan in Tucson. And thank you for the question, Susan. She wants to know, what are the global dangers that you are tracking that you think are under the popular radar?
Well, I don't know if anti-Semitism is under the popular radar anymore, but to me, and I don't say this simply because I'm Jewish, I think anti-Semitism is a sign that democracy is in trouble. Because anti-Semitism isn't just a bigotry, it's a conspiracy theory, and it betrays a way of thinking that suggests that the kind of liberal habits of mind that used to govern life in democratic societies are sick, are atrophying, have a kind of a cancer in them. Anti-Semitism always comes with a kind of illiberalism built into it, not just because of the conspiracy thinking behind it, but because of the hatred of difference and intellectual diversity, and so much of what Jews historically have represented in one way or another in the many societies in which they've lived. And I worry that what we're witnessing now, which is not just widespread anti-Semitism, but proud anti-Semitism that isn't afraid to hide its face, is the beginning of another terrible 30 or 40-year cycle that will get worse and worse until tragedy occurs and societies feel ashamed. That's why we spoke earlier, Michael, of my sense that this is a kind of a Dreyfus moment, not because we've had a Dreyfus affair, but because it was during the Dreyfus affair that Theodor Herzl, as a journalist in Paris, witnessing the moral and social climate in France at the time, supposedly the most civilized society in Europe, realized that the Jews had no future in Europe, and realized that Europe was on a direction towards a kind of catastrophe for itself and, of course, for the Jews. And that's what really freaks me out these days. It practically wakes me up at night.
Well, when you think about the rise of anti-Semitism and just recently what happened to the Brooklyn Museum, for example, with people attacked, upside down symbols of Hamas on not only the Brooklyn Museum, but on the members of the board and their homes, or what just happened in England with a young man brought to justice for having plans to do something catastrophic to Jews. These kinds of things seem to resonate to those on social media who find them exhilarating and find them inspiring even. And I wonder how much that plays a role in your mind, or how much last person we spoke to and did a podcast with was Stephen Brill, who did a book called The Death of Truth. He said opinions are out there now. Facts are not accorded the same kind of courtesy. So the opinions are simply swaying people to great numbers. Conspiracies.
Well, there's a lot in your question. There is no doubt in my mind that social media has been a tremendous threat to civic democratic life. That, in fact, social media is the greatest misnomer of our day. It should be called anti-social media, in that it tends to produce anti-social behaviors that would have been unthinkable when I was growing up, or at least marginalized and shunned when I was growing up. social media also allows fanatics to find one another in a way that would have been much harder in a different era. Not just the right-wing killers who are on these chat groups in the darker corners of the web, but the kind of Israel haters and anti-Semites who come together to throw paint on the homes of Jewish board members of what is actually an incredibly sort of left-leaning institution like the Brooklyn Museum, This is, I think, what is so destructive. I don't think these people, by the way, represent anything close to a majority, but they do have the loudest megaphones, and they are attracting a lot of people to their cause, and they are essentially giving permission to types of behavior that few of us could have imagined just a few years ago, like what we just saw in Brooklyn or other, that despicable protest outside of the Nova music festival exhibit in New York being another case in point. The grotesque behavior of proud anti-Semites who know how to make themselves heard.
The thing that keeps echoing in my mind is the ignorance of especially a lot of the young protesters who may have idealization like those of us who protested against the war in Vietnam. They may think this is a cause that's worth their time, but some of them are just woefully ignorant, abysmally ignorant in terms of historical facts and understanding.
You'll probably be shocked to know that I think some of those people who were protesting against the war in Vietnam were themselves woefully ignorant and didn't realize never appreciated the scale of the tragedy that would befall the Vietnamese and certainly the Cambodians in the wake of America's collapse in Southeast Asia. But we'll put that in a parentheses to one side, maybe an argument for another day. So woeful ignorance.
I would love to take you on that, but that's okay.
Oh, I'm happy to have that conversation. But leaving that aside, look, I'm willing to accept and forgive youthful protesters who think that in protesting against Israel, they are merely joining the side of humanity and peace and objecting to killing.
Or being outraged against all of the children and women who are dying.
Yeah, absolutely. Except that overwhelmingly these protesters were not outraged. In fact, they were delighted by the fact that women and children were murdered in cold blood in an unprovoked way on October 7th. The same people, these same youthful protesters who claim to be idealists, who claim to be concerned about the feelings of different minorities, seem absolutely indifferent to the millions of Jews who are telling them in one way or another that what's happening now is a wave of anti-Semitism that they are helping to spark. What is astonishing to me is that students at the best universities in America, students who presumably got top grades on their SATs and are capable of some kind of critical thinking, accept whole cloth this hyper-simplistic narrative that is being given to them by Hamas propagandists. I cannot believe that these so-called youthful idealists don't stop to think that when so many Jewish students are wounded and in pain and afraid, that they couldn't care less because there's one student from Jewish Voice for Peace who's raising his hand and saying, well, I'm a Jew who's on your side, as if it's okay to sanction Trump's bigotries by seeing that he makes sure to have a few African-American faces behind him at his rallies. And that's my problem with these kids. It's an even bigger problem I have with the professors who are egging them on, who are not telling them to think a little more critically about their positions, but are actually reinforcing the certitude they seem to bring to political issues.
You mentioned the influence of Hamas. How much of this comes from money from Arab countries that have gone into the universities, particularly the elite universities? I mean, are they getting some bang for their buck? Forgive the jargon here.
I don't know the answer to it. I do know that I've heard reliably that many of these campus encampments could not have happened without outside people providing thousands of dollars of tenting and other equipment. And often there have been cases in which there have been large encampments with 70 tents and 30 protesters. So either every protester decided he wanted a spare tent, she wanted a spare tent, or they're getting help from the outside, and that costs money. I'm not gonna speak on this show about where I think that money might be coming from or who's behind it, but I think that's a worthy avenue for investigative journalism.
Well, speaking of worthy avenues, a couple of questions I'd like to go to that are waiting for you to tackle. This is Reed from Santa Rosa who asks, he says, here's a challenging question. Good preliminary remark, Reed. Where does Mr. Stevens find reason for optimism and hope in the world these days? Feel free to include book and film recommendations.
Well, as Woody Allen said, it's always darkest before it goes absolutely black. Look, if you look at the history of the great democracies, certainly of the United States, every 40 or 50 years, maybe that corresponds with, say, 2 generations, they go through very bad periods. The 1970s was a very bad period for the United States. The 1930s, 1890s, 1850s. So yeah, there's a certain kind of pattern at work here. And democracies have a way of resolving their problems for a reason that I call the paradox of pessimism, which is to say that pessimistic nations, not fatalistic nations, there's a difference, pessimistic nations that spend a lot of time worrying about their problems, actually find ways to address them. And sometimes the ways they find are not what the solutions they find are not the solutions they think they were going to have, but they come about one way or another. So if you look at, the United States in the 1970s, in the wake of the failure in Vietnam, Watergate, stagflation, 3 failed presidencies in that decade, you might have thought, the country's in really bad shape. The Soviet Union seemed very powerful. And yet somewhere in dusty corners of California, some guy named Steve Jobs was dreaming of a computer company, and a little further north in Seattle, some kid named, Bill Gates was thinking about what could make computers interesting, and they were essentially buying spare parts from the major technology firms of the day and creating what has turned out to be a multi-trillion-dollar industry that kept America at the pole position. In fact, if you look back at the last 25 years, or at least 24 years, this century we're in, think of all the great advances, the advances that I think will define the 21st century the way that, say, the steam engine defined the 19th century, or the automobile and nuclear power defined the 20th century. All of those technologies really were born and have taken root in the United States. 15 years ago, it was fashionable to say that the United States would never had reached its peak oil moment and would never be a major energy producer. We're now by far the largest producer of oil and natural gas in the world, thanks to something called fracking. We can debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but we're the number one again. Genomics is not exclusively in the United States, but I think largely happening here. Artificial intelligence, your smartphones, mobile apps, so much of what's happening in the digital world is a made in America phenomenon. Not Japan, which was supposed to be the country of the future when I was growing up, certainly not Russia, and probably not China.
Why is Russia so far ahead in nuclear technology, though? I mean, particularly weaponry. And why has Russia done so well? I mean, I'm not trying to give a brief to communism here. I love what you're saying. about democracy and how it encourages innovation and technological advancement, because I think there's a great deal of truth to that. But, Russia has continued to advance in spite of its being a tyranny.
Well, because, nuclear weapons are a 1940s era technology, or 1950s if you want to talk about thermonuclear weapons. So they're good at that, and they are good at doing a lot of it. But
we're also good at making, getting oil and gasoline. I mean,
well, that's an 1890s technology. I mean, this is a country that is, who would buy a Russian car? Who would buy a Russian watch? Who would buy a Russian coffee maker? Who would buy a Russian smartphone? Who would buy a Russian anything? You would buy, if you're a rogue state, you'd buy a Russian ballistic missile. If you're energy hungry, you'll buy Russian gas. And if you're an assassin, you'll probably buy, Russian know-how in killing people. But that's about it. All of Russia's, the cream of Russia's technologists of their upper middle class, of their upwardly mobile class, 1 million of them fled after the invasion of Ukraine. And they're going to be enriching the economies of the United Arab Emirates and Indonesia and wherever they've found homes, but not Russia.
And where do the Chinese fit into all this as they continue to steal our technology and also advance in quantum ways?
Well, China is a more complex country just because it has so much scale. But I have been saying for years, many years, that China's never going to overtake the United States for a variety of reasons. One big reason is their demography is awful. Anyone who makes money in China immediately tries to get the money and themselves out of China, so they have a brain drain. And they have a repressive system that is unattractive for creative, aspirational people. And, they're extremely good at copying technology. They're extremely good at doing things at scale, but they're not so great at innovating. They're not so great at making friends. They're not so great at attracting talent and retaining talent, I should say. And so the real threat that China poses to us today isn't its ascent. It's, in fact, its decline. And my fear is that Chinese leaders who sense they're in decline might try to solve their problems by invading other countries. And that's why I think the potential crisis with Taiwan is such a frightening one.
Not only Taiwan, but the South China Sea. But let me bring in some more questions here. A lot of people want to tap into your brain. This is Reese from St. Louis, who says, population implosion in many countries is reaching a point of no return where there is no chance to reach growth again with reproduction alone. How big of an issue is this, and what do you think is a solution?
Oh, it's a major, if not, I'm always allergic to these cliches like demography is destiny. But demography is a large part of destiny, right? And we don't have much evidence outside of Israel that technologically advanced countries will want to have babies in sufficient numbers to maintain the size and dynamism of their economy. And that's a problem in all kinds of ways. It's a problem for the social welfare system. It's a problem in terms of entrepreneurialism. Old people, generally speaking, don't start companies. Young people do. And so if you have an old population, it's not going to be a dynamic or enterprising population. Now, immigration, to get back to our earlier conversation, Michael, does a lot to help with this. But it has to be immigration paired with assimilation. What made America so successful in the 19th and most of the 20th century was that you had that incredibly important pairing. We were bringing in lots of energetic people, and we were turning them into Americans who not only spoke English, but were ambitious in school, or at least their kids were ambitious for their kids in school, who were taking full advantage of what the United States had to offer, and were loyal and grateful citizens of this country who came to contribute, not to simply take. Now, I think the vast majority of immigrants who are coming here now feel the same way, but I worry that we don't have the same assimilatory capacities, in part because so many parts of the United States have given up on the concept of assimilation. On the right-wing nativists don't want these people in the first place and certainly don't want them assimilating. On the left, they reject the idea of assimilation in favor of multiculturalism. So we have to get back to that model that actually explains, or largely explains, why the United States became the dominant power that it is now.
Another question for you, Bret, from Donington, Pennsylvania. CJ wants to know, what hope do we have to re-engage voters, especially younger voters, who are apathetic due to a perceived lack of representation in the current polarized climate? Thank you for that.
Well, I don't really blame young voters. I mean, my kids, two of my kids, are looking at your first election and the choice is geriatric Joe versus, crazy Don. Why should you be excited about the choice? It feels very much like a choice of two entirely unappetizing entrees. So we need a system that finds a way to produce better candidates. And I blame much of this on the primary system that we have in this country, where a sliver of partisan voters get to determine what the national choice is going to be. I think the best thing that young people could do, forget the national elections, be sure to vote in your primaries, because that's going to determine the choices that you have in the fall. But it's very, very difficult because we now have a system in which is the opposite of what I think I came up with 40 years ago or so, 40, 30 years ago. In the old days, it was the fringe that bent to the center, and now it's the center that bends to the fringe, and that's bad for the country.
Well, you, as a former stalwart Republican, have said you would like to see Josh Shapiro or Gretchen Whitmer be candidates, both Democrats. Can a woman or a Jew be elected president of the United States?
Yeah, I don't see any reason why that couldn't happen.
In today's climate and all that we've been saying about not only anti-Semitism, but the misogyny that's out there.
We elected a black man twice by overwhelming majorities, and I think that the barriers to a woman or a Jew remain lower in terms of the prejudices of the country than the kind of barriers that President Obama faced. So, I look, there's no doubt that some number of people will never vote for a Jew, just as some number of people would never vote for a black person, and there's some misogyny constituency or misogynistic demographic that just hates the idea of seeing a woman as president. But the reason Hillary Clinton didn't become president wasn't because she was a woman. It was because she was a really lousy candidate, I'm sorry to say.
Speaking of women, we've only got a few minutes left, and I wanted to note for listeners that you are married to the illustrious music critic of the New York Times, who has placed before us, who do we choose between Beethoven and Mozart? That was like, who do you...
Oh, my gosh, you really did your research. So I think Corinna... her job was to make the case for Mozart, but I'll tell your audience a secret, which is that I think that if you really pushed her, in her heart of hearts, she thinks Beethoven is the greater composer.
Where does Bach fit in?
Well, it's like asking Bach is, I guess, the patriarch, but they're different centuries, very different styles, very different ideas of musical form.
Well, can I ask you the question I used to put to my listeners when I had a regular radio show?
Sure.
Between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, who's the best band?
Oh, well, the Rolling Stones. That's not even close.
Again, like Vietnam, there are many who would take issue and disagree with you.
Well, where do you stand on that?
I lean toward the Beatles. I mean, I love watching the Rolling Stones. They're exciting and so forth, but just the versatility of what the Beatles have created and the enduring influence of the Beatles.
Well, it's interesting. That's a good question because, the Beatles in some ways, if I came of age after the Beatles, and when I was a kid, there was an entire hour devoted to the Beatles on my trip to school, and so they really sank in deep. But the thing is that once the Beatles existed, they seemed like like they were a platonic form of music, if it as it were, and you couldn't imagine a world without them, without A Ticket to Ride. I mean, or without Abbey Road or Sergeant Pepper. And so it's difficult for someone in my generation to appreciate not just the creativity or the quality of the music, but the kind of the sense of a revolution. But the Stones were more rock and roll, right? They emerged from kind of more of a spirit of just aggressive rebelliousness. And so that's why I would choose the Stones. And also, I think Gimme Shelter is probably the greatest song of one of the 2 or 3 greatest songs of the last 50 years or so.
Oh, we could have a whole...
More than 50 now that I think about it.
You have a great discourse on that. You're only 50, though. Like you say, you're of a different generation, so...
Yeah. No, I mean, I grew up with my music was in really the 1980s.
Let me ask a final question, and that has to do with your column and, again, a recommendation for those who want really good journalism, not only to read you, but also to read your dialogues with Gail Collins. I'm just struck, though, by some arguments that have been put forward not recently. I went back and reread some of Joan Didion recently and some of Janet Malcolm, and they have this they point the finger at journalists, I don't mean the middle finger, I mean the finger of accusation, and they say journalists have to be, especially polemicists, have to be hostile because they're trying to convince you. Or Janet Malcolm says the purpose of a good journalist and good reporter is to deceive you into trusting them and making you believe in them.
Well, that was a self-description in her case, but...
Good line. But what I'm getting at here is the criticism of traditional journalism, which you and I both are very committed to and dedicated to, and in the wake of all that is assailing it now, what about those kind of arguments that journalists have really gone into a moral pathway that hasn't served the public?
Well, let me answer it in one of 2 ways. And one of them is journalism at its best is just the greatest profession in the world, because it's one of the very few, if not the only profession that allows you to have a foot in the life of the mind and a foot in the life of action at the same time. And for very talented young people, I hope it's a profession that they choose to enter, even if it doesn't seem like it's a bright moment for the profession. On the other hand, I think journalism has done a lot of harm to itself. And of course, journalism is I'm painting with a broad brush, but it's done a lot of harm. It has too often sought to see itself as a form of social activism, which should not be what journalism is about. It's in the business of timely, interesting, relevant information, not activism. I think that there is a kind of a solipsism in the world of journalism, of complete fascination with, what other journalists are doing, what are they saying, who's up, who's down, that ill serves our profession and makes us seem, I think, self-infatuated to any or many reasonable outsiders. I think there is, at least as I see it, a lot of ideological tilting in much of what passes as straight news journalism, often through devices which are kind of transparent for anyone who's paying attention. The experts you quote, the facts you think are relevant, the ones you leave on the side or off the table entirely. And so, my advice to journalists or to the profession is that we need to not just bemoan the state of the world, but we need to take a hard look at ourselves. And we need to ask, how do we recover the kind of authority that the Walter Cronkites of the world had, years ago? That sense that you could trust him to be truthful, be fair, be accurate, be impartial, and be decent. And I guess that's one final point that I would mention. There have been too many stories in the last few years where journalists, often with either ideological agendas or grudges, have turned their gaze on people who did not deserve to have their embarrassing moments exposed. I think of a story that the Washington Post did a few years ago about some poor woman who thought she was wearing an ironic costume to a Halloween party, and the people at the party didn't see the irony, weren't amused, and her life was destroyed on this account. I think of the boys from Covington High School, where a viral moment did a lot of damage to a bunch of kids who were completely misrepresented in the media. There have been too many incidents like that, and so we need, I think, really mature leadership going forward, because otherwise, if you don't have a healthy journalism, we will have, and we're getting, an unhealthy journalism, which again really disserves our democratic aspirations.
Well, before I extend our thanks to our guests, let me thank all of you who joined us for this live episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, and all who will be joining us on Apple, Spotify, or on our website at graymatter.show. And if you aren't yet a member of this podcast, I invite you to join by going to the website, graymatter.show, where you can find any previous episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, and that's Gray with an E. Also invite you to email any reactions, thoughts, or recommendations you may have to me directly at mkrasny@graymatter.show. My thanks to our great Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team of Alex, Shannon, Chad, Colin, Kevin, Jeff, Colleen, Tanya. A special thanks to this week's guest. So good to have you with us, Bret Stephens.
It's been a pleasure.
I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.